Welcome to our final unit of microeconomics. So for this, we are now looking at market failure and government intervention. So that's what this whole thing is going to be about. And one of the most classic examples of market failure is the idea of pollution. So this is going to be sort of a special example. It doesn't necessarily apply to everything in terms of what we're going to graph out here, but it is an important example. One for life, but two, it does actually show up every so often on the AP tests. This specific example because it's a little bit different. So let's take a look at this. When you're looking at something like pollution, this is just general pollution. Like imagine just sort of like tossing stuff out onto the street. For this, we're looking at sort of the marginal social benefit versus the marginal social cost. So the differences here is that you don't pay the social cost individually, but you do reap part of that social benefit. So the social cost is something where it's less tangible. You don't recognize it immediately. So let's think mostly like air pollution, that type of thing. Like you might not notice it. You know that it's there, but you're not feeling that cost. Whenever you do something that causes air pollution. However, you do get the benefit of driving your car around, consuming certain types of energy, things like that, that will pollute the air. You receive that benefit directly. So if you add together all of the benefits of individuals privately, that equals the marginal social benefit. The marginal social cost is the additional cost borne by all of society as a result of these actions. Now, normally when we look at this, we're like, oh, this is basically like a supply and demand graph. We're going to end up, at the intersection of social cost and social benefit. That's how people make decisions, cost benefit analysis. However, if we're left unregulated because individually we don't feel those social costs, we don't feel them at all. We feel the benefits, but not the costs. So if we are left unregulated, we are going to consume until your marginal social benefit equals zero, until we no longer derive benefit from this. And at that point, at that quantity of pollution, if you think of it in that sense, when we pollute that to that level, our marginal social cost is much higher than our marginal social benefit, much higher. So this is an example of market failure. We are left unregulated, out of equilibrium as a result of rational decision making. This is just a closer up picture of the graph. This is taken directly from your textbook. It's just the idea that you produce, you consume, all the way until social benefit equals zero, until you derive no more benefit from it. Now you might be thinking, Mr. McNair, this is weird. There's like an equilibrium, a social equilibrium amount of pollution. So shouldn't you be advocating for no pollution? Well, to a degree, but you do have to think of it as a cost benefit analysis. If you go too far to the left, I mean, there is such benefit that you could be deriving that you're not getting. So societally, no, I mean, there isn't. You shouldn't have a zero emissions, at least at this state. You do, work your way back. So that's the long run as you advance technology and things like that. This is just consumption of energy and things that exist immediately to do it. So you do have to kind of keep that mindset. So if we think about the external cost of pollution, this is the uncompensated cost that the individual or the firm imposes on other people. So as we're looking at the cost of pollution, you have to think like worse air quality that can cause breathing problems and things like that. There's pollution of the groundwater. There's pollution of the land itself. Other things, streams and waters that aren't necessarily just groundwater. All of these things can be polluted, and that is uncompensated in many cases to individuals, and it is imposed on people who might not have anything to do with the consumption that caused the pollution. So that's the idea of a negative externality. And we'll go over this a little bit more later, but it's the idea that it's an external cost that's imposed on society, on people who aren't necessarily in the market. So if we're looking at this inefficiency, we can see that the society would actually gain from regulating pollution. So you can almost think of that as a deadweight loss. It is the gain that you could have had you regulated back to equilibrium. So remember, anytime you're not in equilibrium, there's going to be some amount of inefficiency. There's going to be deadweight loss. We're now translating that into what society would want and a societal loss or benefit. And that's what's going on here. So how do we fix these externalities? Well, there is the idea of private solutions, and that's the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem says that as long as you have property rights and they're clearly defined and you keep transaction costs minimal, then you can find a private solution. In other words, whoever is polluting will have to pay monetarily or compensate in some other way the party that is harmed. Sometimes you do see this. Sometimes you see, I know fracking companies do this a lot. As they're fracking for natural gases, they are imposing costs on the people who live in the area. So frequently they will provide water, they will provide money, they will provide things for those people in the area as an attempt to compensate them. However, there are many issues with the Coase theorem. And the main one is transaction costs are way too high for a private solution. I mean, imagine you as an individual are going up against a billion-dollar company. Who is going to have the upper hand there? It's obviously going to be the billion-dollar company. And in the meantime, that you're working through all the lawyers and things like that as you're negotiating, I mean, who has the better lawyers? Who has the ability to craft a contract that might be more beneficial for them? Going to be, in most cases, the business, because they have more money. There's also the possibility of delays as they keep appealing the rulings in the court cases. You can have these delays, and that hurts the individual harmed more and more and more. So the Coase theorem can work in theory, but the power dynamic, the power structure there is too great of a difference in most cases to have it actually work out. And so the transaction costs are very, very high. Even in those examples I cited of the fracking companies paying people, there's many cases documented where people didn't fully understand the contracts or were harmed more than they thought they would be at the beginning. Now, there are, of course, many people who are happy with their contracts that they've done and happy with their interactions with the gas companies, but it's certainly not always the case. So what are some policies toward pollution that economists recommend? Now, there are the idea of environmental standards. So these are just laws saying you must reduce pollution by this amount. Sometimes people like those, but it incentivizes a way to kind of skirt around things. Emissions taxes. So essentially, this is just you pollute, you get taxed about this much per emission. So you can kind of almost think shifting that cost curve, which we'll talk about a bit when we go deeper into negative externalities. And the one that most economists are actually pushing forward is this idea of tradable emissions permits. So for tradable emissions permits, you have to think of it as each firm has like a certain amount of pollution that they are allowed. And since they have this quantity they're allowed to pollute, they are incentivized to actually sell off those permits to pollute and become more efficient themselves, because if they become more efficient, they sell off those permits, they make more money. So this tradable emissions permit, sometimes you'll see it as like a cap and trade. You'll hear politicians talk about that. That's thought to be a very market-based solution, incentivizing the right moves on firms, because not only are you incentivized to sell off your emissions permits, You're also incentivized, if you're somebody who needs to purchase them, you're now incentivized to actually become more efficient yourself, and less pollute less, in order to not have to purchase as many emissions permits. Um, and those are just some of the aspects that could be used. There's, of course, a lot of different ideas in terms of reducing pollution, but these are just some of the basic ones that you hear about most often. Um, so that's an intro to the idea of externalities, and a little bit about market intervention and market value.